Nice welcome to our conversations with Diotima at the Center of Women Philosophers at Paderborn University. I'm very proud that today our guest is Robin Arianrhod. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I'm delighted to be here and I'm very honoured to be part of this wonderful program.
Thank you. So let's start with our questions. So your book, Seduced by Logic, Émilie du Châtelet, Mary Somerville and the Newtonian Revolution, has received much attention. What compelled you to write this book, a book on Émilie du Châtelet and Mary Somerville?
Well, it was an interesting journey for me because many years ago when I was interested, indeed seduced by the power of mathematics as a young girl, when in those days, I was told girls can't do maths, you know, they might get to be all right up to this level, can't do higher mathematics. So the years went by and then I discovered the existence of a number of women who were working in mathematics in history. And I thought, this is wonderful to go back and look at history and see that there were women who could do it. And it's not true what people are telling me. And I really felt a relationship with Émilie du Châtelet and Mary Somerville, probably particularly because they were working in primarily in Newton's work, and I was wanting to study the theory of gravity. So I thought that's a way to talk about these two women who could cover between them a century or more of the development of that process. So it sort of evolved from my own love of maths. Then I needed some heroines, and I found the heroines, and then I had to work out a way that I could write about them to help other women and men to get interested in these women.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a bit about du Châtelet's and Somerville's contributions, why they were so important for the history of science?
Well, I think in the first place, they achieved an incredible level of mathematical sophistication for their time and for their level of education. They were mostly self-taught, and they became experts at a time when very few women were involved they weren't allowed to go to university. They weren't allowed to be part of academic institutions. And yet they became leading and recognised experts on Newton's theory. And in du Châtelet's case, this was particularly important because at that stage, Newton was still very controversial. You know, we take it for granted today. It's passed all the empirical tests and, you know, it served as the basis for Einstein's theory and so on. But back in 1700, it wasn't necessarily well received, and there were a lot of physical and philosophical questions about it. And du Châtelet became well known because she published and she engaged in debates about the time of the time. She took on leading intellectuals and was prepared to disagree with them. She tried to work out a way to integrate Leibniz from a metaphysical point of view with physics and Newton's mathematical point of view. That was very innovative, and she got a lot of attention at the time. She helped to promote the controversy about vis viva, which was what we now call kinetic energy, but then they had no real idea of what it was, but there was this debate about Leibniz's formula and whether it was conserved and so on. So she was a real player in promoting in a really clear way the work of Leibniz and the work of Newton.
And now coming to Mary Somerville compared to du Châtelet?
Well, Mary Somerville, by the time Mary Somerville was involved, Newton was then accepted, but there were still some controversies about his work. One of the key ones was whether the solar system was stable or not. Newton had said it probably isn't because of his theory of gravity, that there'd be mutual perturbations between all the planets, and so on. And so there were a lot of questions still, even though Newton's theory had passed a lot of tests, particularly 2 successful returns of Halley's Comet, which had been predicted on the basis of Newtonian maths. The first one happened just after Émilie de Châtelet died, and the second one Mary Somerville wrote about. But she then became an expert. By the time she was studying Newton, the French had actually taken him on board, having found it very difficult to accept him to start with. And they had made a great progress in the mathematics of modernising Newton's mathematics. And in particular, Laplace had actually solved that question of stability. And he'd written a very important book called Mécanique Céleste. And Mary Somerville translated that into English, or actually the first 2 books, and she added a commentary to explain some of the basis of that. And so that book was used as a textbook in Cambridge for the next 100 years, which was fascinating because Mary Somerville had taught herself. She had been an illiterate girl and she was not sent to school properly, and she taught herself, and then she wrote this fabulous book that became a textbook at Cambridge that very few people could understand, and only the elite male scholars could read it. So there was also controversy about the calculus dispute between Leibniz and Newton, and you know, who discovered it first and all of that. But Leibniz had a better notation, which is the one we still use today. Newton knew all about calculus too, but he just didn't use as good a notation. So Mary Somerville had not gone to school. In England at that time, they were still teaching Newton's form of calculus. She'd had to teach herself. So she learnt Leibniz's way because she was reading Laplace. So she not only helped bring Laplace's ideas to the English academic world, she also helped promote the Leibnizian form of calculus. But interestingly, going back, one of Émilie de Châtelet's great achievements was her translation of Principia, Newton's book. So she translated Principia into French. Somerville translated Laplace from French into English. And both of them did a lot to promote the use of calculus, because Newton, of course, although he invented calculus independently of Leibniz, he didn't use it specifically in the Principia. So one of Émilie de Châtelet's great contributions was not only her translation, but she added a really important commentary which explained how Newton formed his theory and what had been done since in her lifetime by people like Maupertuis and Clairaut and Daniel Bernoulli. But then she reworked she had about 70 pages where she reworked some of Newton's geometrical proofs that he had in Principia in Leibnizian calculus. So these 2 women were experts not only on the content of Newton and Laplace and Newton, they also were at the forefront of the mathematical language that was being developed to express the ideas that we now take for granted as Newtonian, because Newton didn't write it in the same way that we now do. So they were very important, both of them. They made great contributions, and other ones as well, but they're probably the 2 key ones.
I think it's clear that your book is about contribution about history of philosophy and science, not a contribution on feminist philosophy, gender debates. However, do you think that, in any case, your book could contribute to women's studies?
I would hope so. I chose not to focus on academic gender debates and feminist theory, because I really wanted to just set it up biographically to show the conditions for women and those particular women, and to show who, very briefly, who was working in the field and who wasn't. And so I hoped that way would be enough to show, by example, I guess, that these women who were working at a time when very few women were educated, let alone made such great contributions as these two women did. And like, for example, Mary Somerville was working at a time when she was denied an education because the thinking in her time, and particularly her class, she was sort of a lower middle class, was that serious study would actually damage a woman's health. Her brain couldn't cope, because it was found out that women had smaller brains than men at that time. So they thought, oh, they can't possibly cope with deep mathematical study. It will send them crazy. So I think just by showing those debates that were around about women, and I tried to include a lot of that along the way. Just what were the contemporary debates? So I tried to do it from a contemporary point of view rather than a modern feminist point of view. So I look at a little bit of the French Revolution and what the attitude to women was, and all sorts of incidents throughout the book to sort of set the scene for what the situation was for women, and then to show these women struggling against the odds and becoming successful, making a real contribution in a man's world. So I hope that would contribute to women's studies, albeit in a non-theoretical way.
Okay. A last question regarding to the title of your book. Can you explain what does it mean, seduced by logic?
Well, I guess for me, the reason I wrote the book, when I was young at school, I was seduced by mathematics. I just thought, the way you can get real proof with mathematics, pure mathematics. You can do a proof and you know it's true. Different matter when you apply the mathematics to physics, which is what ended up the book being about and what I ended up studying, because of course you're making mathematical models that have to fit with reality and be tested and so on. But nonetheless, that concept of proof, and the way that Émilie de Châtelet, whose great contribution, well, she had many, but one of them was translating Newton and commenting on how he did his theory, and taking part in the debates that were going at that time, like what constitutes a theory. I mean, Newton's approach was very controversial because he relied so much on mathematics, which rather than causal explanations first. So the mathematics was really important in that story, and so that had been so important for me. And when I was setting out to become a mathematician, there weren't a lot of women role models in my own world, so I had to turn to history, and I discovered de Châtelet and Somerville, who were both working in a field similar to me. And so I felt I had been seduced by the logic of mathematics and the kind of logic behind Newton's construction. And so I suppose I put that onto the women too, that I assumed that because they came, well, I know it's true that, you know, when they didn't discover mathematics and science until they were adults, you know, and when they did, they fell in love with it. I mean, Mary actually was a little bit younger. She was 15. She'd never heard of algebra. And she saw these strange X's and Y's in a magazine. She had no idea what it was. Somebody told her it was algebra, but she never studied it. And she was utterly, well, I would say seduced by the power of what do these magical symbols mean. And that set her on a journey. So I suppose I took my own experience, the fact that those two women had inspired me in my journey, the fact that they both fell in love with mathematics. Émilie du Châtelet also, she was about 25 when she really started to take her first serious mathematics lessons. And she was really in love, as I said, with the idea of the clarity that you can get with mathematics. And that was part of her contribution later to when she studied Leibniz as well, to try to bring that mathematical clarity that Newton had to and then the metaphysical depth of Leibniz, and to try and bring some sort of mathematical clarity, I suppose, to a synthesis of the two, which she did in her book Institutions de Physique. So, yeah, I guess that's why.
Thank you very much for coming and joining us at our center and at the Libori Summer School. And it was a great pleasure that
thank you.
You were here, and thank you very much for your wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. Well, it's, as I said before, it's a delight to be here and to meet, with you and Ruth and the students and discuss our work together. It's been a real honour to be able to come here and actually exchange ideas in person. So I've been delighted to be here, and I'm really grateful. So thank you.